Hey everyone, it's really exciting to be here today. I just want to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country, the Yorta Yorta people, and recognise their continuing connections to the land, waters and culture, and I pay my respects to their elders both past and present. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of my, how did I get here today, and a lot of that comes from the support of First Nations people, in particular First Nations women. I lived for a long time in the Central Deserts in Pintupi, Lurija and Pitjantjatjara country, and I sat with those old ladies for a very long time, and I think they saw the potential that I had as a leader for my community and just how much that they invested in me today, and I wouldn't be here today without the sort of leadership and support that they offered me. So I'm here today to talk to you about preventing and responding to men's violence against trans women. And I think the premise of where we want to start today is that trans women and men have the right to access healthy and respectful romantic relationships like any other people in our community. And today when I'm talking about trans women, I'm talking about a really broad group of people who might identify as a woman with a trans history or experiences, trans women, trans feminine people, and other sort of cultural identities as well. And when I'm talking about men, I'm talking about cisgender men. And this is the sort of like future that we want. And this, one of the people that I connected with as a part of the TransFem project was a Malaysian Hindu trans woman, and she said, "I recently got married to my partner. I feel so happy. He makes me feel so beautiful. He's a very kind and understanding man. I couldn't legally get married in Malaysia, but I can here in Australia. As a transgender woman, it was important to me to get married to feel secure and stronger in our relationships. On our wedding, we had all our friends and family come along. We celebrated with a full heart." And this is what we want for our future. And it is important to be aware, but that's not all of trans women's experiences. Actually, trans women are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence. We have had the murders of trans women across this country, in particular First Nations trans women, sister girls, and trans women of colour, especially those from migrant backgrounds or refugee backgrounds or sex workers, and we have not had the justice. And I'm not talking about carceral justice, I'm talking about justice where there is a response, where our relationships are respected, are supported, and that there is an investment from our society and from our services to stop that violence. Everybody here in this room, no matter what your role is, has a role in ending men's violence against trans women. Many times I do this presentation and people go, "But I don't know anyone in these relationships," or "I don't know any men who are attracted to trans women." I'm here to tell you that actually many men are attracted or in relationships with trans women, but because of shame and stigma in our society, those relationships are often hidden and secret. You just have to look at the amount of transgender porn that men are watching that features trans women to realize that this is actually very common within our society and that we need to address this. Here we look at some of the evidence from Private Lives 3 that talks about LGBTI people's experiences of intimate partner violence. And for trans and gender diverse people, those rates of intimate partner violence are incredibly high, including for trans women. I think here we can also see in some of it is trans women obviously have a diverse sexuality. And we know that the majority of perpetrators of intimate partner violence are cisgender men. And so trans women who might date other women and might identify as lesbian, their experiences of their relationships, why there can still be issues, there's less risk of really high rates of violence. But I don't know, when I see this stat, and I know all the trans women that I've interviewed over 100 transgender women and cis men in and around their relationships, and I could count, there was one trans women that I interviewed who hadn't experienced violence from men. So it can be, your experience of violence can also be impacted by who you're dating and who you're having relationships. We also know that the rates of sexual violence, that trans and gender diverse people are going to experience that. And it's our responsibility. It's like sexual health is a place where we can intervene, where we can support healthy and respectful and consensual relationships. And so the ZGBC has done significant work in developing a series of resources to educate both community and professionals to be able to do this work. We first created our website called TransFem, which is about healthier relationships between trans women and cis men. As far as I'm aware, it's an internationally leading body of work where there are resources for cisgender men. There's also resources for trans women, but there's also resources for people's friends, families, and our broader communities so that you can understand what's going on in those relationships and you can break the cycles of violence. After we created the website, we realized that community was accessing those resources, in particular men. Men are our biggest users, but we realized that our practitioners weren't engaging as much. And so then we worked on creating a resource for practitioners that is called Responding to the Objectification and Fetishization of Trans Women by Cisgender Men. I have that guide here. I recommend that you take that guide. And then from that, we also heard sometimes, feedback from our community that it's going great that you're doing all this work for trans women and cis men, but what about us? And so we took our learnings from that project and we created further resources for the trans and gender diverse community. And so we have our resource, Gender Euphoria and Sex, that is for trans and gender diverse people, about learning about sex and consent. Because if you constantly experience discrimination and stigma throughout your life, how do you know what a healthy relationship looks like? And so this is collating the collective wisdom from our community and from our allies and being able to share it with our community. But we also have done work in creating resources for the partners of trans and gender diverse people through our gender diversity, sex and consent resource, because I guess levels of sexual violence or the inequity in power in those relationships that often leads to sexual violence won't change unless we, share that information, in particularly for young people. I'm concerned sometimes when I'm talking to, services that are talking about sex and consent, but because we've had this significant backlash against gender equity, but also against LGBTI people, that they're not talking about LGBTI people's experiences of sex and consent. And unless we're doing that, like many people, including many men who might date trans women, don't necessarily identify as a part of the LGBTIQ community. Many men who date trans women might identify as heterosexual, or they might be bisexual, but they might be on the sort of like down low. So what are the drivers of violence against trans women? Many of those drivers are the same drivers of violence that we know about that impact cisgender women, including gender inequality and rigid gender stereotyping and dominant forms of masculinity. But some of those other unique drivers of violence include things like cisnormativity and heteronormativity, just that the assumption that the only healthy relationships are those of cisgender heterosexual men with cisgender heterosexual women. And that drives violence in our community, but also it impacts our services and the history of our work, because many of our services have just been set up for cisgender heterosexual people and their sort of like relationships. We also know that it's driven by things like transphobia, the fear and hatred towards trans and gender diverse people, but also transmisogyny. Transmisogyny is a unique form of, discrimination that impacts trans women and trans feminine people, and it's the intersection of misogyny and transphobia. And in a Western cultural context, transmisogyny is really rampant. When we're hearing about the sort of lashback against the trans and gender diverse community, it often centers on trans women in sport, trans women in family violence services, where we're portrayed as a threat to cis women and to children, despite there is no evidence of that. what there is evidence of is that trans women are much more likely to be victims of violence, and there are significant barriers for us being able to access the services that support people who are victims of violence. And perpetrators of violence know this, and they target trans women because of that. Also underneath this is a layer of homophobia and biphobia that relates to sort of like rigid gender norms and dominant forms of masculinity within our society. And this is because of the myths within our society that really sort of portray men who are in relationships with trans women as gay. And in that, it stigmatizes trans women. It says, you're not really a woman, we see you as a man, but it also doesn't acknowledge the diversity of men's sexuality within our society. So what can cisnormativity and heteronormativity look like, and how does it impact those relationships? And so this is one of the ways. It's from one of the people we interviewed, a lecturer, and she said, I've had men tell me directly that, but despite the fact that they love hooking up with trans women, that they wouldn't seriously date us. That they only date cis women because that's what their family expects from them. However, I deserve love and respect like any other person. I am worthy of a relationship. I would be an incredible asset in any family. And so there's this history of only blaming cisgender men for perpetrating violence against trans women. But what was really clear in our sort of community consultation is that it was also driven by the people around men. It was delivered by their ex-girlfriend, their family members, their peers, who shamed them for their relationships with trans women and often went to extreme lengths to reinforce this idea of what was a man. And so that might have looked like things where men's, if they were divorced and maybe they'd had children, it might have been his kids going, you will never see your grandchildren again if you continue to date this trans woman. Or if there was a family business, they would be like, we're cutting you off from the family business and financial support if you continue to date her. And that when families and friends did that, when they shamed him for that, he was much more like, those relationships were much more likely to break down, but he was also much more likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence. Oops. And so it can also be impacted by, I guess, these dominant forms of masculinity and people around men reinforcing that. And so some of the men talked about, I guess, their shame and their stigma around being attracted to trans women and their confusion around what did it mean for their sexuality to be dating a trans woman or to be attracted to her. And so Patrick said, the first few times after sex I thought, oh, why did I do that? I'm a straight guy. I was regretful, but then of course I wanted to see her again. And I can't remember if I was nervous or not, but it was something new for me. So trans women often talked about the spiral of shame and how they would have to navigate with that with men, and that actually the moments around after men climaxed in sex was one of the points of greatest risk of violence, where he went out of desire and spiraled into shame. And this is also the point where we have seen the murders of trans women. And so a lecturer said, in their spiral of shame, often after sex, men can sometimes be mean or rude, and it's hurtful. I deserve better. I deserve to be treated with respect. And so what is impacting cisgender men? And so some of it, they talked about their feelings of shame or confusion regarding their sexuality or their attraction to trans women. They talked about their experiences of discrimination, social rejection from their community or from their sort of family. They felt incredibly isolated. They often knew no other men who were attracted to trans women. They didn't see anywhere within the sort of popular press around media the relationships that they wanted or felt like having. They also talked about having incredibly low levels of knowledge about respectful relationships, and there was nowhere to get support. Often many of our services, like relationship counselling, they know nothing about these relationships, and so they aren't being able to provide, or they're not outreaching any services for men who might be having these relationships. And until we change the culture around providing men support around these relationships, the violence against trans women, in particular the sexual violence, won't stop. In my sort of interviews with the men, the first group of men that I interviewed were men who were in relationships with trans women, or who were long-term allies, or who had once caused harm to trans women and wanted to make amends for the harm that they had caused. The second group of men that I interviewed was off Lakanto. Lakanto is like a dodgy dating site. You can buy a lawnmower on Lakanto, but they also have this bit called Transgender Adventures. And I interviewed men who'd caused harm. And what I found was that many of those men had deeply misogynistic and transphobic attitudes and behaviour, including preferences on how trans women should behave, how they should act, how they should look, or what their bodies should be like. They often viewed trans women as hypersexual and thought that the only valid relationships with trans women were exclusively sexual. They honestly believed that some of them, that all trans women like to be objectified, that they like to be treated like an object. And they appeared to be seeking relationships with people that they can have power over. And that's one of my really biggest concerns, is often in this movement of gender equity, we've got to be aware of who are the groups of people, and the groups of women in particular, that we are leaving behind. Not just trans women, could also be, you know, people from refugee or people from migrant backgrounds, or First Nations trans women. Because what I heard from men was that some of the men were saying, I prefer hooking up with trans women or relationships. And I was like, why? And some of them were like, I feel safer. And I just had that little alarm bell, and I'm like, why do you feel safer? And underneath that, they were like, because I've had relationships with cis women who have called me out for my misogynistic and violent relationships, and when my community has challenged me on those behaviours, so I am looking for women who I can have power over. And when we leave trans women behind, it means some of the most violent men in our communities are sometimes the ones who are targeting trans women, because they know that we can't get support. And so, how does this impact trans women? So trans women talked about, trans women are getting a raw deal, an incredibly raw deal within our society. I think many of the cisgender women who are in this space are going to be very familiar because of the overlaps of, you know, if you're dating men, they're very similar, some of the experiences. But for trans women, it's just further amplified. So many of the trans women talked about incredible pressure from men to express yourself in a hyper-feminine sort of manner, or to pass as cisgender, often centered around men's fears and worries. What will people say if they can clock that you are a trans woman, if they can read you as a trans woman, or if you're hyper-feminine, it somehow takes away some of my sort of like shame and stigma around having these relationships. Men, because of their feelings of shame, often limited where they would meet trans women to sort of private spaces such as hotels or private residences, which obviously creates imbalances in power in relationships, but also increases risk to trans women, because how do you screen your dates if they won't meet you in public? And that all trans women could experience this, but if trans women in particular who didn't pass, like I don't pass as a cisgender woman, I don't care, I don't want to, but many trans women might or may want to, but not passing impacted your ability to access public relationships. Cis men were often refusing to introduce transgender women to their broader sort of family, friends or community. And also there was a significant amount of pressure from cis men regarding trans women's gender affirmation and whether they should or should not access different medical or surgical procedures. They're often centered around men's desires rather than supporting trans women's bodily autonomy. Like trans women told me stories of men throwing $10,000 at them and going, go and get your breasts done, or if you go and get lower surgery, I'm going to leave you, or if you don't get lower surgery, I can't take this relationship, seriously. And here is Roxanne talking about how this impacted her. Before I had breast surgery, men kept telling me, oh my God, if you do your breast implants, you'll become perfect. Then I would love to see you every day. I was always waiting for when I was ready, but they kept telling me all those bullshit things. So it talks about how can you know as a trans woman what you want for your own body when there's so much pressure from your partners or from society about what's expected or what they want. The trans women also experienced, experienced high levels of sexual violence and sexual exploitation. And they talked about the poor consent practices of their partners, including people asking incredibly invasive questions. We're talking about dating apps, like somebody first straight up before you've even had a conversation about asking you about your junk or what your body sort of like looks like. They had many of the men had incredibly poor awareness about trans women's experiences of body dysphoria, which really impacted trans women's ability to, I guess, sort of consent or what they were wanting in terms of like sex and intimacy. Many of the men had learnt behaviours from porn. The ZGBC does not have an anti-porn stance, but when the only place that men are learning about sex with trans women is from porn, that creates some sort of unhealthy sort of like expectations or ideas of how we want to have sex. I've had men tell me who've done quite violent things, and I've questioned them going, where did that come from? That's not okay of behaviour. And they're like, I learned it from the movie. And I'm like, what movie? And they're like, porn. And so some of it is about, in terms of like the education that we need to give community, and especially young people, we need to inform them about relationships and sex and intimacy from trans women, because if the only place that men are getting their information is from porn, that it can be harmful, or where they haven't learnt skills to unpack unpack some of the things that they're seeing within porn. There was also a lot of coercion and manipulation, and so the men were often aware that trans women, they were aware of their experiences of discrimination and stigma in society, and that they would use that. And so they were aware that trans women, sometimes had challenges in accessing relationships, or they wanted to see, themselves as a woman. And so they would use that to sort of manipulate them to meet their own ends. The trans women were also, because of the discrimination and stigma, they experienced a lot of objectification and fetishization. And here we just get to see a little bit more of what that sexual exploitation looks like. Katrina said, I've pretty much had a revolving door with guys. Some of that is around me seeking validation as a trans woman. It's a behaviour that I have learnt that I'm now trying to change with counselling. Now I know that when I compromise my own self-worth for 5 minutes of attention, it never ends well. It's not healthy for me. Manipulators are very good at masking their behaviours. They tell me they're looking for a girlfriend, that I'm beautiful, that they love me, and that they want to spend their life with me. However, as soon as their desires are met, they lose their interest in me. These experiences can be quite soul-destroying. All I want is a genuine connection with somebody who actually respects me. So it talks about how trans women are incredibly vulnerable to being love bombed. But here we also see Katrina internalizing that and blaming herself. And it's like, you are not to blame for men deliberately targeting you to manipulate you. But we do need to be providing that sort of education to empower trans women to know how to screen out these behaviors, so you're sort of lowering your risk of experiencing sexual violence. So also, I think we've talked a little bit about body dysphoria and genital dysphoria today, but for people who may not be aware, it's just the distress or discomfort that some trans and gender diverse people can feel about certain aspects of their bodies and how they might be perceived by others. It's also, if you're being engaged in sort of like sexual health testing, this is really important to be aware. It's also important to be aware that trans and gender diverse people can often use different language to describe their body than cisgender people, and that if you are in a role where you're talking about bodies or talking to your clients about bodies, it might be important to check in a consentful way about what language that they're using and to reflect that back at them. But here we see Liz just talk about her experiences of, experiences in terms of sex and intimacy and body dysphoria. Sometimes I don't feel like having sex, or I don't feel like doing certain stuff because I felt uncomfortable. With dysphoria, you can't really do much but accept it at this point. I'm saving money to have surgery, but it's something that I still have to live with for now. I would tell my partner what I am and what I am not comfortable with, but it's something we need to agree upon. But for some trans women talked about freezing, especially, and freezing when they're having sex and intimacy and not really knowing that what some of their experiences may have been around body or genital dysphoria, and that they had a right to go, that's because it can impact how you have sex, where you want to be touched, and what consent looks like. But if your partners aren't aware of that, it can have a really big impact. And here we see Q just talk about when you do experience discrimination, how it can impact your ability to assert yourself and sort of practice sort of consent. And so Q said, I'd often go out of my way to fulfill other people's expectations, even if it wasn't what I felt comfortable with. I felt like I owed them something because of my transness. Because they accepted me despite my transness, I felt like some sort of obligation to them. And so trans people often do feel obliged to meet their partner's needs, and I think we need to be having conversations, especially around sex and consent, getting people to better examine power in relationships and how you can navigate that and how you can also assert yourself when you do experience discrimination and stigma. I guess just sort of winding up, I think, trans people do experience really high levels of objectification and fetishization based upon your trans identity, your skin color, your race, your ethnicity, particular aspects of their bodies. And it's really common experience that I think we need to be doing more work in terms of like education and addressing. And here we saw one of the men that I interviewed, and he really sort of it sums up what objectification and fetishization is. Most of my experiences have been sexual, and I haven't really gotten to know anyone that well to befriend. I've only seen them a couple of times in a row, no long-term friendships or relationships really. So my history basically is sexual with trans people. It's not something that I want to live with, like in a relationship. I've only ever done it as a fantasy sort of thing. And so this is what occurs when our society doesn't value our relationships. And as I said, I've got the practice manual outside, because trans women may not be able to identify what fetishization looks like. Because if this is how you are treated all the time, you may think some of these behaviors as normal. So if you're screening someone for fetishization and they don't go, what do you mean by that? Sometimes it's about being able to explain some of what that looks like so that they can be able to self-identify that themselves. And just sort of before, as I guess I'm finishing up now, a couple minutes left, some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about that are trans and gender diverse consent considerations is that discrimination, it drives violence against trans and gender diverse people, and we need to be doing work to shift this. Stigma and discrimination can lead to trans people feeling obliged or being pressured to meet the sexual needs of their partners, and that some trans and gender diverse people can experience distress or discomfort with certain parts of their bodies. And just lastly, I'm only here today. All of our resources are free and out there if you want to grab them. I just really encourage you in terms of if you are delivering education around sex and consent, you actually make them trans and gender diverse inclusive. We need to do work within our sort of sexual health services to make them trans and gender diverse inclusive. And in particular, because there's so much stigma and shame, I'm sorry, but men aren't going to disclose. It's going to be hard. What are you going to do to create a safe space for men to disclose that they might be hooking up with trans women? And that having resources within your services that men can see or can access will help sort of shift those experiences. And I just also really recommend everybody reads our practitioner guide. So thank you for today. It was really great.